In the 4th chapter of Exodus, Moses faced a dilemma which is quite common in our lifetimes, and he was called to do something which he had never done before. He was called to do something which he believed he was not good at. And it was presumed around this time that he was about 80 years old. He was called to go speak to Pharaoh, to let his people go. And I'm sure in Moses' mind, he was thinking, well, talking to Pharaoh, he could very well kill me in that very moment. If he did not like what I had to say, he could very well kill me. You know, the story, as you read the story here in Exodus 4, you can only help but think how vastly different the story would be if Moses was so fearful that he stopped in his tracks. He was like a deer in headlights, and he couldn't move. He was of such intimidation that he would never even go to Pharaoh. The story would end right there, wouldn't it? Moses' name would be lost in the pages of the Bible. His story would have been reminded as that of one of a failure, because he was such overcome with fear. That's how the story could have ended. That's how Moses' story could have ended. Starting in verse 10, Moses said unto the Lord, O my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither heretofore, nor since thou hast spoken unto thy servant, but I am slow of speech and of a slow tongue. He is simply saying right here, do not call me. I am not a very good speaker. And not many people are very familiar with speaking. But as you uncover Moses' life, how he was such a great leader, how he led the Israelites out of Egypt, led them in the wilderness for 40 years. And over here he's saying, I am not a very good speaker. I am not the one you should be calling. This is not the task for me. How amazing is it to see his first view to this task? It's such a great task. And how it really influenced his whole life to go do what God said. But God saw fit to encourage Moses. In verse 11, the Lord said unto him, Who hath made man's mouth? Or who maketh the dumb, or deaf, or the seeing, or the blind? Have not I the Lord? If God has created the heavens and the earth, if in him we move and have our being, if he has created the mouth of man, the very cords in our throat to speak, our very conscience, does he have not the power to support Moses, to help him overcome his fear, and to thereby persuade Pharaoh? In verse 12, he says, Now therefore go, and I will be thy mouth, and teach thee what thou shalt say. In his fear, God felt the need to encourage Moses. Encouragement is something the church still needs today. I am persuaded that many in the church may want to do very grand things. They maybe want to become teachers. They maybe want to become preachers. They may want to go out and evangelize. They may want to teach the Bible to their fellow lost man. But they are in such great fear that they're intimidated to even move, to even take one step. How many are there in the church that have never led a Bible study, and that have never led a sermon, that have never taught another person after many, many years of being in the church? Not because they didn't want to, but because they were in such great intimidation that they never did it. I heard a word of, the fighter Mike Tyson once. In an interview, he said, every time before a fight, I'd always be afraid, but I'd never be intimidated. What he meant by that was before each fight, before each trial, he would be afraid. He'd be nervous. He'd be a little scared. But he would not be intimidated. That is to say, he would never stop in his tracks, even though he was afraid, even though he was scared, even though he was nervous. He would still go out and face the trial ahead of him. That is the thought, that is the mentality that I believe God expects of his church. Does he not know that perhaps we might be a little shy? Well, I'm sure he's well aware that we might be a little shy. He might be very well aware that we're not very familiar with speaking in public, of teaching. But he does not expect us to be intimidated. He does not want us to be intimidated. And so Moses did lead the people of Israel for his out of Egypt for the 40 years in the wilderness. And it said that he died at the age of 120 years old. And then Joshua was to take his place. Joshua, at this time, was also supposed to be about 80 years old. You know, as you read the stories, I think sometimes in Exodus, you really think that these are a bit young men. These are 30-year-old people, maybe 20 years old. They're very young men, very strong men, agile. But no, they're very old people. And they were called to do something very grand. Now, I'm not 80 years old, but I think I get the feeling of saying, well, you know, I want to sit back a little bit. But it was not in the plans of God for them to sit back. He had great ambitions for them, great aspirations for them. But speaking of Joshua, as Moses died, he was called to the task to lead the people of Israel. And again, as any person taking up a great task, he was fearful and he needed courage. The book of Deuteronomy ends on a very somber note. Moses, the servant of the Lord, died in the land of Moab, and the children of Israel wept for Moses in the plains of Moab 30 days. So the days of weeping and mourning for Moses were ended. The people of Israel had only never had Moses as a leader. That's all they knew. That's the only leadership they did do. And what great encouragement did they have from Moses? But now he was gone. Now they were left without him, without a clear leader, without someone to motivate them, to strengthen them. They were thus discouraged and in great fear for the future of their nation. They still had to go out and fight the nations in the Promised Land. They still had to go out and inherit the Promised Land. Joshua was to fill the shoes of Moses and lead the people. By this time, Joshua was presumed to be about 80 years old, according to Barnes. He and the people of Israel needed courage. The great task required sustained resolve and bravery, and to lack correct attitude about failure. That is to say, if the people of Israel, once Moses had passed, had said, well, we ought to just give up. We don't really have a clear direction here. We don't really have a clear leader here. He was all we ever knew. We're very fearful of the nations that we have to conquer, and we don't really want to do it. They would have failed at that very moment. The mentality of them would have led to their failure. The mentality of our people today, how we look to the task that God requires of us. If we think we're already going to fail, we're going to fail. That is what Henry Ford used to say. And I don't quite recall the quote right now, but I know he said something along those lines. But no one goes up and already thinks they're going to fail. But God provoked Joshua to virtue. Multiple times in the first chapter of the inspired book is a call to strength and courage made to Joshua. In Joshua 1:6-7, he said, "Be strong and of a good courage, for unto this people shalt thou divide for an inheritance the land, which I swear unto thy fathers to give them." He says, "Only be thou strong and very courageous." Now you look at that. He says, "Only be thou strong and very courageous." He's saying, this is the blessing that I will give you. This is how I will bless your people. But you still have to go out there and get it. Now, if you had the courage, if you had the strength to go do it, God would surely bless you. God will be with you. Only be thou strong and very courageous. That is all God asks of us. He doesn't ask for us to have a very big church in numbers. He doesn't ask for us to be a very rich church. But He asks us to be a faithful church, to be a strong and courageous church, to do the things which He requires of us. That thou mayest observe to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded thee. Turn not from it to the right hand or to the left, that thou mayest prosper whithersoever thou goest. No matter what trials you face, if you be strong and courageous, God is going to bless you. The principle, as all principles in the Bible, in the Old Testament, applies today. God still today only calls His people to be strong and courageous. And He's going to bless them. In Joshua 1:9, He reminds them again, "Have not I commanded thee? Be strong and of a good courage. Be not afraid, neither be thou dismayed. For the Lord thy God is with thee, whithersoever thou goest. The provocation of God to Joshua brought success. Holy provocation still does today. Perhaps the greatest sermons in our memory are the ones we were personally encouraged. I wrote sermons in quotations because sometimes they say sermons are not just always just preaching. Sometimes it's just a few words someone says to you, and you get the very great lesson. A lesson you remember far more than any other sermon you might have heard. You might forget a sermon within maybe 3 weeks, but you might remember what someone has said to you, how someone might have encouraged you, and how greatly those few words changed your life. I think every preacher was encouraged to go preach. And by very few words did you have great men go out and preach, go out and do much great work. And so the point of that matter is that we ought to be encouraging our men. We ought to be encouraging those in the church to do great things, to strengthen them when they are in perhaps a great state of nervousness or fear. Sometimes the greatest motivator to work is a compliment or seeing those it helps. And think of this, when we help others, this in turn often inspires others to do the same. The greatest actions often begin from a simple few words of encouragement, or even the example of another. I heard of a story, the name of a man named Ernest Shackleton. And the story went, well, it was a true story, is that in 1914, he and a couple of men and a crew sailed to Antarctica. What they wanted to do was they wanted to go cross Antarctica on foot. They wanted to walk across it and be the first person to do that. But while they were on their expedition, it was called the ship Endurance, they hit a pack of ice and were stuck in the Weddell Sea. And with their ship crashed, they were living, I guess you could say, on icebergs, on floating pieces of ice that would just move. All they had was a wooden boat. And so they lived on that iceberg until eventually the ice began to, burn away. And some of the men made the decision to go on a wooden boat to try and reach the nearest island. And I want to remind you, over by the Southern Ocean, due to the magnetic field over there, the waves over there are some of the largest in the world, 60 to even hundreds of feet. But they were going to go across the ocean in a wooden boat. And there are many accounts of how they survived. Not a single person died in this story, or in the account. Not one person died. They all survived, every single one, on that expedition. And they said the reason they made it out, the reason why they survived, because they were encouraged by Ernest Shackleton. They were motivated. Their morale did not fall. They were encouraged to keep on fighting because they encouraged one another. It is said that they celebrated holidays and birthdays. When someone would have a birthday, they'd give them have a spoonful of sugar as your type of holiday. It is said in Christmas, they celebrated with singing and small gifts. I'm not exactly sure what type of small gifts they had, but on Christmas, they celebrated with singing, small gifts, conversation, and fellowship. They tried to maintain a bit of normalcy in their hard times. Shackleton, in a quote, he said, "Optimism is true moral courage." They had to be optimistic. What the story really tells us is that in any situation, the church can face anything. The church can face trial, adversity, if they encourage one another. But in much the same way, as the Israelites under Joshua, the church, the now army of God, it is the army of God, needs provocation. Our task today requires sustained resolve and bravery, and to lack correct attitude still means failure. Beginning in Ephesians 6:12 and ending on verse 18, Paul tells us that each of us are a soldier. And that's the way we ought to view ourselves. Every Christian ought to view themselves as a soldier, fighting in a war against the forces of evil. For this is how Paul put it. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood. That is to say, we don't wrestle with swords. We don't fight men and kill men in order to win our battles, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places. Wherefore, and here's the encouragement. This is the battle. Take unto you the whole armor of God, that ye may be able to withstand in the evil day. And having done all to stand, stand therefore, having your loins girt about with truth, and having on the breastplate of righteousness, and your feet shod with the preparation of the gospel of peace. Above all, take the shield of faith, wherewith ye shall be able to quench the fiery darts of the wicked, and take the helmet of salvation, and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. This verse, I guess you can very simply simply describes the militant nature of the church. We live in rather permissive times. Sometimes a few of our states are very permissive. Many families have a very permissive. The fathers are permissive. There's many of our school districts and our education systems, they're permissive. And what I mean by that is that when push comes to shove, they fall on their principles. Many in our day are walking on eggshells to avoid making anybody mad, causing any type of problem, rebuking anybody, because they don't want to cause any fuss. They don't want to ruffle anybody's hair. But God simply says this, that He described the church as one that would be aggressive, one that would be stern, would be firm, one that would be prepared with the preparation of the gospel of peace to combat the forces of evil. Not to compromise, not to tolerate, but to fight. This is what God had always intended. He had never intended divided loyalties, never intended for us to shy away from the task. But He intended the church. See that person, that force, that wall in the gap between the permissive people and truth. But as we described it, the church is an army, and therefore we can learn from the armies, the military forces in our world today. The militaries in our world today understand the great principle of encouragement. Do they not appeal to our sense of duty? That we ought to be there fighting in the front lines, that we ought to recognize the costs, recognize the privileges that we have. And we ought to serve our own country. Are there not thousands of men who would be willing to serve the U.S. Army, the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Air Force, and now the U.S. Space Force? If the push came to shove, if the need was dire, if there was such an emergency that their way of life could be compromised, that their neighbors, their family, their lives could be threatened, hundreds of thousands of men would come rushing to the front line to serve their nation. I heard even in World War II, there were some men who were not fit to serve, and they would commit suicide because they were not fit to serve. They saw all their friends, all their family, serving the nation, and they felt like a coward because they could not serve. We often describe it as patriotism. We all know patriotism. It's called the pride, or as defined, it's the pride, the honor, and loyalty for one's own country and way of life. Do they not also appeal to us to recognize the deadly consequences of indifference upon our neighbors and family? Are we not called to recognize the consequence of indifference to the task which God has put us to, has called us to? That each and every person is going to reap something, and each and every person is sowing something, and each person is going to stand before the judgment seat of God. And we'll all be judged for every good and every evil thing we've done, every secret thing. That is something which I believe a lot of people need to recognize. The Bible is a reality. It's as real as any person drowning. It's as real as any fire in a building. It's as real as anything you might see. And as I've said this before, and I'll mention again, to recognize the fire in a building, you never just sit in a fire and you just wait, never do anything about it. And with the sin in our world, if we just see that as the fire, the sin in our life, and we're just sitting there, doing nothing, then we have not truly realized the reality of it. If we look at a drowning child, and we do nothing, we just watch them as they drown, we don't realize the danger that's in there, the consequence of that, then we do not realize the danger of not evangelizing the world, to not see them as drowning children, as people dying, and if nothing is done, cast into everlasting destruction. Thirdly, do they not train and forge bond with the men in their ranks in order to face trials more confidently? The armies, the militaries, they spend millions, perhaps billions of dollars training their men. Each of them have a platoon. They forge bonds with their men. So that none of them are going alone afraid, feeling that they have to face the enemy alone. But so they may be confident in their trial and their hardship when things get hard. But it is not the army of God to have the same fervor of duty as any military or nation on the earth. For Paul said, our citizenship is in heaven. And the same recognition of the consequences to the failure of the task. Peter wrote, for what shall be the end of them that obey not the gospel? For we must all appear before the judgment seat of Christ, knowing therefore the terror of the Lord may persuade men. Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister during World War II, he had one of his greatest speeches. It was, I guess the title of it is, "We Shall Fight on the Beaches." And it occurred after France was to be doomed, and many of the British, equipment was over there in France. But the Nazis had taken France in such a quick manner that their equipment was stuck there. Their men were stuck there. During that account, it said the citizens, in order to get back their equipment, they used fishing boats, they used citizen boats to go over there and try and get their men out. And in this dire situation, when all seemed lost, he gave this speech. And I'm going to read just a paragraph of it. He said, "We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and the ocean. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty, and so bear that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour." And another one, he said, "Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory how long and how hard the road may be. For without victory, there is no survival." It was through, again, words of encouragement that the British Empire managed to survive. Their homeland did not fall prey into an invasion of a Nazi invasion, but they survived because they had a man to motivate them, to encourage them to fight when all seemed lost. God expects us to do the same. In Hebrews 10:24-25, he says, "Let us consider one another to provoke unto love and to good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another." Exhorting means greatly encouraging one another. And here, he's simply talking about services. Coming to church, uniting with your fellow brethren. Do not forsake that, but exhort one another. Encourage one another as you face hardship. Williams' translation says, "Stimulate one another to love and good deeds." Goodspeed says, "Let us arouse ourselves to rival one another's love and good deeds." The English Standard Version says, "Let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works." There's a law in physics which says that what's in rest will stay in rest unless acted upon by another force, an outside force. And that's Newton's first law of motion. But in psychology, I believe it's much the same. There is that principle that a man won't do nothing, a person won't do nothing, unless there's a great motivator to do it. Otherwise, it often never gets done. And when it comes to tasks which we must do, oftentimes it takes an outside force. It takes a word of encouragement to get us moving. But once it gets moving, it's not going to stop unless acted upon by an outside force, that's the physics. But I think, honestly, the greatest threat is to never get to it. That's the saying. You never got to it. That is the greatest threat. God does not want many in the church who never get to it. He wants people to be working, to do the deeds that which He wants us to do. Speaking of that, Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes 9:10 and verse 12, "Two are better than one, because they have a good reward for their labor." What that means is that if you have two people doing a job, you can get it done a lot better. If I have two men, instead of one man, going out and evangelizing people, they can go out and evangelize a lot better than just one. They can go out there and encourage one another. They can go out there and support one another. If there should be some type of disputation. Verse 10, he says, "For if they fall, the one will lift up his fellow." As to say, if one fell alone, and he's not able to overcome, the other will pick him up, will encourage him, will lift him up. "But woe to him that is alone when he falleth, for he hath not another to help him up. And if one prevail against him, two shall withstand him, and a threefold cord is not quickly broken." They are stronger, they are encouraged, and they can do a lot more good deeds, a lot more great work. But together. Well, I'm going to have to skip this bit because I'm running out of time. But there is no lack of provocation in our society today. As we look to the Holy Scriptures and we see how the apostles, how Jesus Christ himself were provoked to good deeds, we can much follow the same suit. Jesus was provoked or stirred up when he saw the temple defiled by merchants in Matthew 13 through 15. Are we not to be provoked when the church is used for such a way, as a business? Are we not to be out there and be as Christ and say something? Jesus was stirred up to see so much religious hypocrisy in his day, to see a man be a hypocrite. He had to rebuke them. Are we not to be much the same, stirred up to see the same thing? Paul's spirit was stirred within him when he saw the idolatry of the Athenians. He saw all the false gods, all they worshipped, all the immorality which was going on in Athens. And he felt provoked. His spirit was stirred up to speak up, to say something. Peter, John, and Jude were stirred to write their epistles to combat false doctrine. In Jude 3, they earnestly contend for the faith once delivered unto the saints. They each called men to take a stand against the Gnostics, against the false doctrines of their day. The church is to be much the same way, to not be complacent, to not tolerate the things of our day. Paul was stirred up to preach the gospel, knowing the inevitable end of them who obeyed it not, in 2 Corinthians 5:11 through 12. The church's need is great. That is to say, the church's need is great for holy provocation, because God expects great things from his church. As member, God expects each person to be a soldier, to endure hardness. To endure hardness means to endure trials. As with anything, you may be, like I said, shy. You might be fearful. But God knows those things, and he's telling you to endure it. To endure it as a good soldier of Christ. You never see any army which has a people who are deathly afraid of something. They train their men only to have them very deathly intimidated to even go fight. Or for them to be slothful in their fighting. But no, they are to face trials as a good soldier. And God expects us to do the same as a good soldier of Jesus Christ. He expects us to earnestly contend for the faith which was once delivered unto the saints. To be ready, always to give an answer to every man that asketh you a reason of the hope that is in you. To study, to show thyself approved unto God, workman that needeth not to be ashamed. In other words, God expects His church to be much like a professional, trained, and militant army. An army which does not retreat or compromise. An army that is steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work. That is to say, they never stop. They never stop finding new ways to do good. They never stop working. One that is stand in their doctrine. Paul used the phrase, be like men, be strong. An army which does. He said unto Timothy, make full proof of thy ministry. The way I kind of look at this verse is, you often hear the saying, the proof is in the pudding. Simply, the way I kind of look at it is, you're going to do something so thoroughly, so vigorously, that one can look at it, and they instantly see the proof of it. They see the great work that's being done. And they don't have to look very hard. They already know you were out there working very vigorously. And you thoroughly completed your work. The proof is in the pudding. In Christ, He set the scale for the influence of His army, the work of it, their light which shall shine before men, that people would look on and look at your great works to see what the church is doing. And they would glorify God, our Father, which is in heaven. And of course, His ambitious mission. He says, go ye into all the world. Do you see how greatly ambitious that is? We often put it on a very small scale. We ought to evangelize those in the community, and that's true. Those in our city, those in our state. But Christ said, go ye into all the world. He's looking much broader than that. When Christ told the apostles to go preach the gospel, He wasn't just talking about there in Jerusalem, in that area. But no. Go ye into all the world, all of Europe, all of Africa, and preach the gospel to every creature. If you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, repent of your sins, confess His name before men, be baptized for the forgiveness of your sins, as we stand and sing.